Okay, so this afternoon we'll be presenting on transforming digital legacy estates to create a more sustainable future. First, we'll share our working definition as to what exactly is a digital legacy estate. Then Pam and Brian will share some of the history and context of both KDL and UCL DH, or Digital Humanities. We will discuss the goals that motivate us to work towards addressing our legacy estates and some of the challenges we've encountered when undertaking this work. We will discuss our approaches more generally in terms of past approaches and what we've learnt, including examples drawn from our legacy estates and how they've been approached. We will talk about our current approaches and as well as what we foresee to be our future solutions. And finally, we have a call to action. We hope the experiences we share today will galvanise those of you who have unaddressed legacy estates to take up the challenge sooner rather than later.
So throughout the presentation, we will use the term digital legacy estate, which for our purposes we're defining as an organization's digital legacy estate as collectively referring to the projects which are supported or hosted without a plan for archiving, sustainability, or long-term support. There are a lot of different reasons projects will get into this state. For example, early digital humanities projects would generally assume that the hosting would continue indefinitely, and their creators were really focused on building new and innovative digital research tools, and they didn't anticipate the increasing challenges of security or the complexity of ongoing maintenance as digital technology evolved over time. So I'll give you a little bit of history and the context of the digital legacy estate at King's, specifically King's Digital Lab. So KDL was founded in 2015 when the Faculty of Arts and Humanities decided to separate the Academic Department of Digital Humanities from the development team, and that development team became KDL. Along with our new name and our development team, we inherited 30 years of DH projects at King's, which constituted in excess of 100 individual projects, basically over 100 sites that we were hosting. And that included a huge variety of work, from simple conference websites to highly experimental digital tools to really traditional DH projects such as prosopographies. And all those different projects came with a wide variety of stakeholders, including the project investigators, the Arts and Humanities faculty itself and their departments, external organizations, funders, users, and so on. And all of these varied stakeholders and their thoughts and feelings and stances on the estate was another major complicating factor in how we were able to approach managing that estate.
Thank you very much. So ARC was formed a few years ago to kind of fulfill the requirements that various research teams around UCL and the wider community had. So we build digital research infrastructure for people both inside and outside of UCL and the community in general. In terms of DH, UCL DH, so Digital Humanities, sorry, was formed in 2010, so it's 14 years old now. So as you can imagine, have some kind of really old projects now that really do need some sustainability work. They look after over 50 projects, many of which are pioneering projects that are key to the community. So they are absolutely in need of sustainability strategies now.
So when KDL decided to tackle this estate, our first task was to rationalize how we supported that estate and put everything on a long-term sustainable footing. So in consultation with our faculty, we agreed a set of core goals for what we were trying to achieve with what we termed our archiving and sustainability project. So these were preservation of high-value projects, which is obviously a very subjective criterion, but as part of that, we considered projects' impact, their reputation, their scholarly value, and their ongoing usage. We also were aiming for technical and financial sustainability and to gracefully decommission any project where ongoing support wasn't a suitable option. As you can imagine, this process wasn't straightforward, and untangling a digital legacy estate that is years in the making posed some major challenges.
So speaking of which, do have some bad experiences with these. So the main thing that you're going to have to think about is going to be around infrastructure and time. Now, these two are very closely related. So when it comes to infrastructure, do you physically have the resources to host a project both now and in 5 or 10 years' time? That could be resources in terms of compute, that could be resources in terms of finances to sustain the underlying infrastructure that you need. And again, with time, do you have the kind of resources in terms of people to support a project? That could be in terms of a complete rebuild. Sometimes you have to just scrap it and start again. Sometimes you have to kind of maintain the project on an ongoing basis, both of which take a lot of time, as Pam will show you later on. In terms of cybersecurity now, I know there's been some mentions of Cyber Essentials, which people don't particularly like, but that is an issue. So you may be hosting legacy projects on the same corporate networks that host your student systems, host HR systems, and lateral movement is a big thing. So do you have the expertise or even the kind of risk appetite for hosting those kind of things? Are you willing to take the risk that your legacy software isn't going to get hacked and somebody can then move over to a HR system and steal sensitive information? Even if you do, your InfoSec department may not. There's the reputational risk. So this is kind of twofold. The first side kind of ties into the cybersecurity aspect, which is that if your site gets hacked, how bad are the headlines going to be? If you lose HR data because of a piece of old software you're running, are you willing to accept those headlines? Is that something that your institution is going to be happy with? Probably not. And also, if you just start taking research offline, if you have a piece of historic data that's been online for years and you suddenly pull it off the internet, that's not going to look good either if you just start getting a reputation for killing research from years ago that's already been paid for. That will also come into the political issues as well later on. There's some legal issues and some ethical risks that you take. So accessibility regulations, if you're making major changes, what constitutes a major change that then means that what you're doing falls under the accessibility regulations, and you suddenly have to think about that. But there's also the ethical side of this. So even if you're not legally obligated to bring a site up to the current accessibility regulations, is it fair that you keep a site running that isn't accessible? So there's something to think about from both sides there. And GDPR is also an ongoing issue. If you have a site from, say, 15 years ago that's been collecting information, chances are it probably doesn't have a privacy policy in place. You may not have formal consent to collect that data. So any kind of usage of that could be kind of a bit risky. Lost connection. So this is kind of more going into the personal issues now. So sometimes you simply don't know who the academic partner is. They could be from a department that has been gone for 5 years. Nobody knows who actually developed this project. So you could simply not know who has the authority to say, right, we need to turn this off. Or again, they could simply be on leave and nobody can get hold of them, or they could have gone to another institution. And then the political and interpersonal issues. This one can be a bit strange sometimes. But sometimes academics or project partners take it personally. If you say to them, we can't host your website for much longer. You could get the conversation along the lines of, why are you taking my research offline? Why is it my data that gets nuked from the internet? So. Oh, sorry. And then finally, this is the biggest challenge. Sorry, I forgot about this. The biggest challenge is that as a developer especially, you're going to be touching code that has potentially not been touched for years. Whether that is code that has just been in a GitHub repository that's never been tested, or as I found out, compiled Java that you no longer have the source code for that has embedded passwords in it. Those sort of things will happen. So yeah, that's one of the worst risks as a developer, especially.
Thank you. Okay, so some of the challenges outlined by Brian we could foresee, but there were plenty that we couldn't, and they emerged as we began to investigate and explore options of addressing our legacy estate. So as UCL is in the early stages of addressing their legacy projects, I'll be discussing the past approaches that KDL has taken and speak to how these have evolved over time. So historically, it was assumed that digital humanities projects would just be supported forever, that they were the digital equivalent of a scholarly monograph. The reality is that it's not feasible, especially as bespoke digital projects are built with technologies that are no longer supported and sometimes become security risks. Initially, we began to have conversations with academic partners, RSEs and sysadmins, and with faculty to begin to educate stakeholders as to the practical reality that legacy projects needed to be addressed, to explore options on how to do so, and to start proactively proposing solutions. Some of these conversations were really difficult, and what we found really helped us is that we could refer to an authority. So this might be a technical sort of authority, in which case we could say this project presents a security risk. It's not feasible for us to leave this online. Or to refer to faculty where someone more senior may have made a decision based on recommendations that we had made. We also began to establish a process and an understanding of the options we could offer for archiving and sustainability. So the options we have established include service level agreements, assigned costed service level agreement or SLA. These are reviewed regularly, usually every 5 years, and depending on the relationship between the academic lead and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at King's, which is where we're based, it might be faculty supported, it might be externally paid, or it might be a mix of both. If the project is amenable, it may be converted to static and hosted at no or low cost. Initially, our static sites lost all dynamic functionality, but we've now been able to include a new search functionality, which for some projects has proven to be better than the old search functionality that they were initially developed with. Migration of the site is also an option, especially if an academic partner is now resident at another institution. This option can take some time though, especially if there are knotty legal considerations around data ownership and copyright that need to be addressed and contracts that need to be put in place. And finally, we can minimally archive the project. So we take the project offline, we put up a static page with some metadata about the project, a screenshot, as well as links to where snapshots of the site may be archived, so that's generally the Internet Archive, or if it had been captured at the UK Web Archive when that was accessible. We also commit to keep a copy of the project on our servers for a minimum of 2 years. But as we begin to migrate to new infrastructure, we're beginning to consider those minimally archived projects that we can delete completely if they have been archived for over 5 years. So the pie chart here indicates how many projects have currently been addressed under our archiving and sustainability approach. The tiny slice for GitHub access is a minimally archived project, but rather than putting up a static site, we just redirected the URL to the project's GitHub page. And I think the importance of the process, I think, is pretty evident, but one of the most important things, and it's because I'm responsible for it, is that as part of that approach, we began very early on to document our decommissioning process. And what that meant is that we would capture information around the development histories of these projects, the infrastructure needs, their project leads, recommendations and decisions made, any special requests, and their dates of decommissioning. So the template for decommissioning authorization has gone through many iterations, as has the process overall. But the decom documents themselves have proven themselves extremely valuable because that we're able to answer queries that come in sometimes even years later, whereas before, I think a shrug would be pretty much what you're most likely to get. So here you can see some examples of some projects that we've applied our past approaches to. I've not time, unfortunately, to discuss them all, but I wanted to highlight a couple that presented additional challenges. So early English law, which is on the right-hand side in the middle, also called EEL, was migrated to the University of St Andrews, and although we reached an agreement on migration relatively early, there were difficulties in getting a contract in place. So the contract was atypical. 3 different institutions needed to be involved, and there were several conversations required around copyright permissions. So conversations around possible migration began in September of 2019. We began writing the decom doc in August of 2021, and we archived our copy of the site, completing decommission at KDL in October of 2023. Stormont Papers, which is unfortunately not on the slide, proved to be technically unsustainable in its previous form and presented major reputational risks. It needed to be handled gracefully. It is currently minimally archived, but we hope that it will find new life in the future as we receive emails from various people interested in reviving it, but this can only be done in a new form, which is dependent on further funding being sought.
So out of this really complex archiving sustainability project with lots of specifics, we evolved a standardized approach. So this diagram outlines how we make recommendations for sites as they come to the end of their SLAs. While these decisions are complex, hence the complexity of this chart, it is at its core as the process aims to be fair, transparent, and consistent. We have a set of criteria, and KDL makes recommendations for each site based on those, and then the final decisions will always rest with the authority of the faculty, which has a formal SLA committee annually. So while this doesn't always make it easy, we found that it makes the conversations with the partners and then decisions about what to do and from the faculty far simpler. And being able to refer to these standard policies and these criteria, which is backed by the authority of the faculty, helps us to ensure that the process is fair and that it feels fair to all the partners involved. And that decision tree is one part of our larger process, which we use to make sure that how we approach everything is consistent and documented. So our decommissioning process outlines who's responsible for each step. It helps ensure we keep our digital state in good order on an ongoing basis. And while the documentation can take time, it pays off readily anytime a difficult question arises. These processes are always evolving, but that clear documentation enables us to maintain the essential features of consistency and transparency.
Cool, lovely. Thank you very much. So what can we do going forward with web-based research outputs specifically? As you might imagine, it's a combination of technical and non-technical things that we need to think about to make sure that everything we produce is sustainable. From a technical point of view, the first thing is just build with sustainability in mind right from the outset. Think about questions such as, do you really need a dynamic CMS for a web-based output? Use the fancy tools whilst building the website. Can you consider having the output be a static website? And going on from that, I'm going to skip down a couple of bullet points, so we'll go back up. But don't be tempted by unsustainable features. If you need a search engine, consider using a front-end JavaScript-based search engine rather than, say, a back-end search engine backed with Elasticsearch or Solr. Speaking as somebody who had, I think, what was it, about 30 or 40 sites affected by Log4j that used Solr a few years ago. Make sure that your infrastructure and everything that goes with it is fully reproducible. Having your app containerized isn't a perfect solution, but having a containerized 7-year-old application is going to be far easier for somebody to maintain than a 7-year-old piece of Java code that is undocumented and nobody knows how to run. On that point of kind of those fancy features, be very careful with cloud services. Now, I'm not talking about using cloud services in general when it comes to building research data pipelines and what have you. But when it comes to web outputs, imagine if you have a website that has a basic search functionality. For Digital Humanities Project, this was faceted searching, which was the kind of go-to fashionable thing a few years ago. If that is backed by, say, an AWS Lambda script, which generates the facets on the fly, and then you have images hosted in S3, think about who is going to be supporting that or even funding that in 5, maybe 10 years' time. We don't know what those things are going to cost, or especially if you use Google services, if they're even going to be around in 5 years' time. They do have a habit of killing things. I think one of the things that you'll probably notice if you spend a lot of time looking at old research websites is how many people have used Google Maps on their Contact Us page, and that Google Maps thing will just say invalid API token. That's quite a common one that happens, and you'll, especially in my day, I see it every week pretty much. And the other thing as well is just document everything. Now, we say this as a developer, we say this constantly, but when you're looking at somebody else's code from 10 years ago, having clean documentation is absolutely key. We don't like writing it, and it's one of those chores that we just have to do. But when it comes to this process, it is a lifesaver if you have clean documentation. And then we move on to the non-technical stuff. So have these conversations early. Talk about the sustainability of a project right in the project inception phases, in the pre-application stages. Get those conversations in before it becomes a problem, and then you can design a project with sustainability in mind. And one of the things that you can do, which funders are now relatively open to including small pockets of funding for managing the sustainability of a project in the post-funding period. It wasn't so much of a thing when we started this project years ago, but now funders are open to that. So you can kind of get away with putting that into the funding application and actually having money to do this, which was a novelty right at the start. And again, raising awareness. So whether that's the PI, any kind of third-party investor that you might have in a project, or the funder themselves, make sure they are aware of these conversations may be coming. A PI might be, or may be far happier with the decision to convert their website to static in 5 years' time if they knew the conversation was coming, as opposed to you just springing it on them after 4.5 years and say, hey, your website's no longer sustainable, we need to take it offline. And again, there's some more documentation, I think, as we tried to stress, as Sam did earlier, the importance of documentation at all stages. So document decisions that you've made with regard to the project, continuity planning. Academics do move to other institutions. Believe it or not, some academics do even retire. So trying to plan for what happens when an academic is no longer around is something that is key. And finally, be transparent. Tell people when you're doing this project that it's not just their project you're doing it for. We're doing this for everything. We're doing this as standard practice. And that will help kind of smooth some of those interpersonal issues we spoke about earlier.
So I believe we're out of time, but I would like to just explain this graph. This is the time spent on getting our estate in order. You'll see the big scary chart at the front, but I will say that this is why I would encourage everyone to address your estate now. That chart, that line is bigger, the more complex and older your estate is. And then there's a lot of major advantages between the lower risk, better security, better use of resources, and yes, potentially a bit more money from the funders if you have that clear process so you can ask for funding up front. So I'll end that there and say thank you very much to everyone. You can contact us via any of these means if there's questions later, but I might have time for a few questions now. All right, then thank you very much. Any questions?
While those questions are coming, I've got one, which is, where did you get the list? How did you drop that initial list in the first place of what everything was?
Our systems administrators. I don't know if Brian can answer this a bit better.
So it's a combination. There's no one place to get it all from. So we had some documentation on some projects. You might have some in your project management tools. You may have knowledge of what servers you have kicking around. In some situations, it's just a discovery mission. You just have to look for, there might be random applications running on a random server that you're not even aware existed. So like, because never trust that a software developer hasn't run a piece of code somewhere that you wasn't aware of. So yeah, so it's just the case. Best way I can describe it is probably just a bit of discovery. Just have a look around and that's all you can do.
I'm looking at the infrastructure side rather than speaking to the people. Or, yeah. Okay, thank you for that. And now we've got another question from Andrew Lister, which is, when projects are migrated, does copyright get transferred or is it more complicated?
I think I can share this question with Pam. So it really depends. I think for some of the projects that we've migrated, if it's the project lead that is going off to a new institution, then theoretically whatever copyright's invested apart from the code perhaps will migrate with them. With things like EEL, where that is not, University of St Andrews isn't where the PI was based, we got into a really lengthy conversation, and what ended up happening is that the transcriptions are available but the images are not, because that was never, I think, resolved.
So that particular one, the PI institution could happily hand over their copyright, but they had copyright permissions from a variety of other institutions to use images, and we ended up basically putting in the contract that says, we'll give you these images, you can't put them online until you have resolved all the copyright issues with the individual institutions. But yeah, generally, copyright can go with the PI. It gets complicated if the PI's institution is not hosting, and that's where you probably need a contract.
got time for one more then, which is from James Frost, and that was, do new technologies like WebAssembly allow expanding the range of projects that can be minimally hosted?
I would say absolutely, but use things like that with caution. The best way I can probably describe that is at one point, Adobe Flash was the new hotness that everyone thought was the solution to this problem. So new technologies do help, but as always, use with caution.
Okay. Right. Thank you very much. Another round of applause then for